Good morning, welcome, or good afternoon. Welcome to the second session of our Gaia Then and Now webinar series. My name is Tom Singer. I'm a Jungian analyst and a board member of ARIS, the Archives for Research into Archetypal Symbolism. For those of you who saw the film yesterday, the first video about Gaia in ancient Greece, I'm sure you're going to be wondering how this ancient Gaia is relevant today, how we can see and relate to Gaia in today's world, and what is the way forward for us if the Gaia mythology or the Gaia attitude to the world is something that speaks to us, or perhaps what other non-Western myths, including indigenous myths or Buddhist myths or Hindu myths, American Indian myths, might be relevant to this discussion. Let's see where Jules goes with all this in the second video, the Return of Gaia, and then we can come back and discuss that, including hopefully responding to your questions. There is so much to take in these videos. They're filled with a lifetime of reflection and distillation by Jules. And that is why we will very shortly be posting transcripts of the videos with footnotes and references to the quotes and images for those of you who would like to follow up. And we will also be posting the videos of the two videos as well, and the conversations that we've had about them. These will soon be available on ARIS Archipelago, which you can access, and I will show you an image of how to do that in just a minute. But before that, I want to introduce formally Jules again by just by giving you her biography, which is quite distinguished. Jules Cashford studied philosophy at St. Andrews University, and then had a fellowship for literature at Cambridge, where she was a tutor in tragedy for Trinity College for some years. She then trained as a Jungian analyst with the Association of Jungian Analysts in London and taught mythology. Her books include The Myth of the Goddess, Evolution of an Image, The Moon, Symbol of Transformation, a translation of the Homeric hymns for Penguin Classics, The Mysteries of Osiris, a retelling of Parsifal for young adults, and a novel, The Crane Dance. She has served as co-editor with Craig Senroque and Tom Singer of the Ancient Greece Modern Psyche series of books, which is based on a series of conferences that we've held in Santorini and hope to be holding another one in the next year or so. With Kingfisher Art Productions, Jules has made 2 films on the painter John Van Eyck, I don't get that right, and 3 films on Gaia. Gaia, Mother Goddess of Ancient Greece, The Return of Gaia, which we'll be seeing this morning, and finally, The Eleusinian Mysteries. We are just about ready to show you The Return of Gaia. Please keep your questions that arise during the second video coming to us by using the question and answer button on your screen. And also, I want to show you an image that shows how to participate in our Gaia Then and Now form and submit related images to that. And if we can have, oh, there it is right there. This image shows you how you can participate in our form and how you can submit images to info@aris.org. To get to the form, you go to aris.org archipelago, and then you click on form, and in forms, you'll see the Gaia Then and Now form. We'll show this image at the end in case you don't get the information. And with that introduction, let's go right to the film, The Return of Gaia, which will hopefully speak to many of the questions that came to you yesterday and that you forwarded to us yesterday.
The Return of Gaia. Both Jung and Einstein, among many others, agree that no problem can be solved by the same kind of thinking which created it. Einstein warned that with the splitting of the atom, everything has changed save our mode of thinking, and thus we head towards unparalleled catastrophes. This helps to explain why, in spite of the devoted work of many people around the planet, it has so far been impossible to reach a universal agreement on how to prevent the global devastation, almost as though it was impossible to imagine what to do. Jung added his own terrifying image. The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. The urgent question then becomes what was, and still is, the thinking that has brought about this crisis, and can we assume that we will even be able to recognize it? We might suspect that a kind of thinking, so powerful as to destroy life forms all over the planet, issues from a distinctly specific and long-established view of the world, one we have been thinking in for so long it now feels natural. But no way of thinking exists in a vacuum. Rather, it comes from an almost inconceivable plethora of feelings and ideas, and more crucially, the values which underpin them, the way of life which comes out of them, and ultimately who we are as human beings, living together with the rest of creation on our one and only Earth. If this is so, then the members of our culture are unlikely to be able to decide intellectually that our former worldview, once so convincing, is now wrong, and thereupon resolutely pledge to give it up. Would we not first have to understand where it came from and why we as a culture have failed to question it for so long? Yet, as though in answer to the crisis of our time, a new name for our Earth has been emerging over the last 40 years, and that is the old name Gaia, and perhaps also the ancient feelings that may come with her. The apparent coincidence that brought the image of Gaia back from its distant past was an ostensibly random walk taken by the physicist James Lovelock with his friend and neighbour, the novelist William Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies and was also a classicist. It was in the late 1970s, and Lovelock was looking for a name for his hypothesis that the Earth was a self-regulating system. He wanted to propose that the Earth had the capacity for homeostasis, that is, for comprehensive inner adjustment and self-regulation in response to changes in the outer world. He was going to call this systems theory, but Golding suggested Gaia, and the Gaia hypothesis was born. Yet the name and the memory of an animate Earth seems to have entered Western consciousness, and since then to have acquired an autonomous life of its own. This is just what we might expect from an image which arises spontaneously, apparently out of nowhere, at once familiar and compelling, as though we had known it all along. This points us to the region of myth and dream, where imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown, the place from which life-changing energies come. But perhaps it was not so surprising that the image of Gaia would catch the imagination of the time, almost as though it had a mind of its own. For only a few years before, we had all in our imagination stood upon the moon looking back at the Earth, as though moon and Earth had changed places. In 1948, the astronomer Fred Hoyle had said that once a photograph of the Earth taken from the outside is available, once the sheer isolation of the Earth becomes plain, a new idea as powerful as any in history will be let loose. It was as though the human imagination was set free to imagine the universe, and perhaps multitudes of universes, world without end. The new idea was the perspective on Earth that did not start from ourselves, looking out, but from beyond ourselves, looking in. And many of us saw a living being, a zoon, as Plato had always said, inviting us to understand that our Earth has and always had character, intelligent, soul, in a word, consciousness. Or we might perhaps say not that Earth has consciousness, but that Earth is consciousness. So it may be that Gaia arose in response to this vision, offering a new home for the imagination to start from, a local habitation and a name. Certainly, the Gaia hypothesis soon became far more radical than Lovelock had intended, as though the excitement of the idea were indeed to do with Gaia herself, with a vision of Earth alive, animate and animated, a subject in her own right, not, as before, dead matter without spirit, an object to be controlled and explained by mechanistic laws. This new Gaia called forth the old Gaia, as though a symbol had been born, suggestive of Yeats's idea that whatever the passions of man have gathered about becomes a symbol in the great memory, which is the memory of nature herself. For once upon a time, Gaia was a living being and the mother of all in ancient Greece, and astonishingly, this was the last time in the West that Earth was formally revered as sacred, more than 2,500 years ago. Even to talk, then, of the sacredness of Earth is to press against the weight of 2,000 years of religious and cultural history, as well as conscious and unconscious assumptions about the nature of reality. But perhaps myths never die. They seek new forms through which to renew themselves, age after age. This is Tellus, the Roman version of Gaia, holding two babies, Romulus and Remus, the legendary founders of Rome. In retrospect, then, it is possible that what appeared as a coincidence, giving a scientific hypothesis the name of Gaia, could be meaningful at a deeper level, invoking the further hypothesis of synchronicity, to point to the way that certain events happening together at the same time may be connected not by cause but by meaning. Even playing with the possibility may take us to a deeper realm, where future thought forms are gestating, mindful of Jung's insight that in the collective unconscious of the individual, history prepares itself. We might expect the first intimations of a new story issuing from the imagination to shine at us from many places at once, to baffle and disturb us with its numinosity, beckoning us beyond our habitual categories of thought, becoming translucent to the eternal through and in the temporal, as Coleridge sees it. It might be numinous precisely because it comes from the depths of the collective unconscious to redress the present imbalance in human consciousness, trying in its image of an animate earth to restore harmony to consciousness itself, to the whole. It may be a signal not just to reflect upon our own human consciousness, putting ourselves yet again at the center of everything, but also to awaken us to the suffering of Earth. In ancient Greece, Gaia's gifts were celebrated for over 2,000 years, up to the 4th century AD. People would come from all over Greece to participate in the mysteries of death and rebirth at Eleusis, under the aegis of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, who was Gaia's granddaughter, born from the union of Kronos, time, and Rhea, the flowing one. It was the time of the year when Demeter's daughter, Persephone, disappeared into the underworld as the fallen seed. Gathering together in autumn when the full moon began to wane, the people would mourn for the loss of Persephone, fast and sacrifice, pray and meditate, until the vision of the crescent moon in the new cycle became for them a symbol of rebirth, of plants and human beings alike. Persephone was reunited with her mother Demeter as the returning shoots in spring, and humans were awakened to the springtime of their hearts, restoring a vision of the whole. Looking back over 4,000 years, it is striking that humanity and Earth were then so deeply related to each other that the holding up of an ear of corn in silence was the culmination of the mysteries, when both Earth and human beings were understood to be reborn together as one. This revelation finds a parallel in William Blake's belief that if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up, till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. Blake's daimon, who taught him painting in his dreams. Yet there is a difference between the Eleusinian initiates' rapt vision of the ear of corn in their own presence over 2,000 years ago, and William Blake's vision of what happens when the doors of perception are cleansed. In Eleusis, the infinite was a communal experience, while with Blake, the infinite is imagined in solitude, becoming present through the poem. Blake's paintings will be our guide through the history of the last 2,000 years, offering the perspective of a unified vision. The work of Carl Jung, Mircea Eliade, Joseph Campbell, C.S. Lewis, and Owen Barfield also shows how consciousness has changed over the millennia, so that we cannot understand the past if we look back only through the lens of the present. Owen Barfield, in particular, has offered a sustained perspective on the evolution of human consciousness and suggests a way of looking at our history which may free us to imagine a way out of our present impasse. Thomas Berry and David Bohm, among many others, have recommended his writing. So who was he? Owen Barfield and C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, belonged to a group of Oxford undergraduates who called themselves the Inklings. They would meet in an Oxford pub from the early 1930s to 1949 and discuss, among other things, the nature of consciousness. Owen Barfield is on the left, Tolkien in the middle, and C.S. Lewis on the right. In Barfield's History in English Words, Poetic Diction, and Saving the Appearances, he understands the evolution of consciousness as falling into three distinct stages of different kinds of what he calls participation with the world: original participation, withdrawal of participation, and final participation. We will define the terms briefly first and then explore them in more detail afterwards. The first stage, existing from the beginning, original participation, he describes as a time when the human soul and the soul of the world are experienced as one whole. There was an instinctive union with the earth and all creatures on earth. Here's a pregnant horse from Lascaux, around 15,000 BC. When she was first discovered, the leafy branch laid across her pregnant womb was interpreted as a weapon, instead of perhaps an animal and a plant flowering together. The human and the natural world were indivisible and could not be conceived in isolation from each other. These were originally hunter-gatherer lunar goddess cultures, discovering agriculture around 9,000 BC. The second stage, Barfield defines as a withdrawal of participation from the earth, which happened at different times around the globe, beginning in Europe and the Near East around 4000 BC, and reaching a crescendo in 2000 BC, continuing through the Iron Age, 1250 BC, and lasting in various forms right up to our present day. What follows is largely the history of the West. This period in history began when nomadic non-agricultural peoples, with gods of sky, sun, wind, and the vast invisible heaven, arrived in Europe from the east. The peaceful values of an agricultural life gave way to animal husbandry and competition for land, and the changing values brought by the invaders. The details can be found in Marija Kimbutas's book, Goddesses and Gods in Old Europe. Earth then loses numinosity and is set in opposition to humanity, as the individual soul becomes separated from the world soul. Over the centuries, the lost numinosity of Earth was transferred to the inner life of human beings, who have, generally speaking, come more and more to dominate the now soulless Earth. The third stage, Barfield calls final participation. He defines this as a new kind of participation with Earth, not in the old original way, which in any case is impossible, consciousness inevitably moving on, but at a new level through the imagination. This involves, he explains, a dual relation to the world, one which acknowledges our present experience of Earth as separate from us, but creates a new poetic union by participating with the natural world, both consciously and imaginatively. The aim is to bring about a new kind of relationship with our Earth, recognizing our essential identity while exploring the specific role of human consciousness within Earth. And he sees this as the unique moral opportunity of our time. William Blake's painting of Puck, Dancing with the Fairies, from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. Yet while they are initially presented as historical phases, they are also phases inherent in all human consciousness at any time, and we may move between them in our thoughts and actions almost without noticing. The poet Shelley's longing to return to the infancy of the world, when everyone was a poet and language itself was poetry, is timeless, as is losing ourselves in nature, music, art, and love. It is only the experience of the numinous, Jung wrote, which brings about transformation in a person. In the West, we are now living through a late stage of withdrawal of participation. So we are in a position to look critically upon its limitations, and so upon the limitations of ourselves at this point in history, even while acknowledging that we are only able to do this because we have in fact already withdrawn participation from the whole, an inheritance that seems to have both virtue and vice intertwined within it, as in the destruction of the Amazon forests, for instance, and also the initiatives for their restoration, rare as they are. This offers us a unique opportunity to consider whether this present state of withdrawal should be seen only as a phase in the evolution of consciousness, and so not the only and ultimate way to relate to the world, which would leave us free to imagine a new kind of relationship. In order to do this, it seems essential to get behind some of the ideas which have been instilled in us as inevitable and absolute, whether through the doctrines of various scriptures, the ignorance of cultures other than our own, the official readings of history before we could evaluate them, the pressing imperatives of social custom, the intellectual valuing of reason over feeling and intuition, and not least, the idea of the absolute superiority of the human project, granting souls to ourselves alone. So to take each of these stages in turn. Original participation. We might already understand this stage of human life through the familiar term participation mystique, coined by the French philosopher and anthropologist Lévi-Breuil, and also from Paleolithic cave art. In original participation, all children of the universe came from the body of the mother goddess, whether imagined as earth or moon, and being of the same substance, are all related to each other. They have the same nature. This is the goddess of La Salle in Dordogne in France, 20,000 BC. There are 13 notches on the bison's horn she holds in her right hand, the number of days of the waxing moon to the full, while her left hand rests on her pregnant belly facing the valley. As Mother Goddess Moon, pregnant with the world in her waxing mode, she discloses the laws of fertility and growth as cyclical in her own image. As woman, she acknowledges the lunar law on Earth. As above, so below, as it was said in the emerald tablets of Hermes Trismegistus 20,000 years later. The world of early people was a thou, not an it, a presence, both numinous and personal, and so a subject in the dialect of thinking, not an inanimate object of thought. All life forms belong to the same continuum of feeling and were related through imaginative sympathy. They did not have to be apprehended by different modes of cognition. What in contemporary terms might now be distinguished by many into the objective natural world and contrasted with the subjective human world were once intimately bound together. So Earth was both more awesome, loving and terrifying, and more personal, peopled with divine presences. This is immanence, where the visible appearance and the invisible source are one and the same. Lascaux Cave, 15,000 BC. Here's the birdman shaman with the head of a bird lying in trance beside his staff with a bird on top of it, as though he is travelling like a bird in the mind to accompany the dying bison in his journey to eternity. It was found in a well 25 feet down. The ancient imagination was concrete, as was the origin of language, embedded in and rising out of deeply lived experience, similar in this respect to art and poetry of all ages. This union of invisible and visible was found most notably in ancient Egypt and in the Sumerian culture of Inanna Ishtar and in early Greek thought. And here is the Sumerian goddess and god beside the tree of life, with the serpents of transformation behind them, understood as the moon on earth, since both shed their skins and both were reborn from their own substance. Here's the pharaoh Seti I receiving the breath of eternal life from ibis-headed Thot, the moon god of eternity and time, holding the caduceus uniting the two lands, 1300 BC, Temple of Seti I. Nearly 900 years later in Greece, Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, 429 BC, shows how Earth was still intimately related to the moral life of humanity, from which it followed that Gaia's law could be profoundly disturbed by the unlawful behaviour of human beings. This is Delphi, a place of worship for Gaia for over 2,000 years since Mycenaean times. Mount Parnassus, Greece. This stone-built theatre was constructed in the 4th century BC, just above the Temple of Apollo. Oedipus the king is quite content in his unconsciousness until Earth suffers. Suddenly, the land of Thebes begins to die. A blight is on the fruitful plants of the earth. A blight is on the cattle in the fields. A blight is on our women that no children are born to them. So it is Gaia who initiates the drama of Oedipus's awakening to who he is and what he has done, the slaying of his father and the marrying of his mother. Reluctantly, Oedipus sends the seer Tiresias to the Delphic oracle of the god Phoebus Apollo to reveal the cause. The oracle, whose first law was know thyself and whose second law was nothing in excess, now defines for all time the meaning of pollution as a human crime against the divine order, known in Greece as hubris, the profaning of what is sacred. King Phoebus, in plain words, commanded us to drive out a pollution from our land. Pollution grown ingrained within the land. When Oedipus discovers he is himself the pollution and leaves the city, harmony is restored and Gaia comes back to life. It is significant that even without Oedipus's intention to do wrong, pollution occurs. Gaia and the children of Gaia are shown to be profoundly related. So here, what happens to humans happens to Earth, and what happens to Earth happens to humans. The soul of the one is also the soul of the other. Or to put it another way, the human story and the universe story were one and the same. This way of being lasted for thousands of years, but it was destroyed or gradually diminished at different times around the world, though persisting in those places where the dominant Western paradigm did not reach, and even surviving in pockets of Britain in an attenuated form up to the 17th century. And of course in Shakespeare, who sees it both ways, as in The Merchant of Venice, where Lorenzo muses in the moonlight with his love Jessica. Sit, Jessica. Look how the floor of heaven is thick inlaid with patines of bright gold. There's not the smallest orb which thou beholdest, but in his motion like an angel sings, still choiring to the young-eyed cherubims. Such harmony is in immortal souls. But whilst this muddy vesture of decay doth grossly close it in, we cannot hear it. Now we come to the beginning of the stage of withdrawal of participation. Joseph Campbell, in his Occidental Mythology, writes that in 2000 BC, when the invasions from the east began and kept coming, a wail went up all over the Near East. Divinities of the nomadic invaders were the gods who had guided their journeys, the gods of sun, wind, thunder and lightning, and the invisible heaven. But they regarded the goddesses of the territories they entered not as different manifestations of the divine, but as dragons and serpents to be slain for the sake of the new order. Here, the Babylonian wind and sun god Marduk is slaying the Sumerian mother goddess Tiamat, depicted as a serpent dragon with a crescent moon upon her head. In the Babylonian text called the Enuma Elish, we learn that with his wind blown from his mouth, he splits her body in two. One half he remakes as heaven, and the other half as earth. And humankind he recreates from the blood of her slain sun-lover. But where he and the other gods become the makers of heaven and earth, the earlier goddesses were themselves heaven and earth. Broadly, in the second phase, the soul of the world also lost its numinosity. The nomadic tribes who conquered the native agricultural communities withdrew the immanent divinity from earth, placing it either in the lights and patterns of the heavens or in the invisible world transcendent to all creation. Mythologically, lunar goddesses of the earth were replaced by tribal gods of the heavens, Enlil and then Marduk in Mesopotamia, and Yahweh Elohim in Canaan. The old mother goddess of earth and moon was seen no longer as life-giving, but as dark and chaotic. So a wholly new oppositional paradigm entered Western thinking, as being inherent in the nature of things. Even the Mycenaean and Achaean Greeks, with Zeus, their god of thunder and lightning, brought with them a way of thinking that valued conquest, as in Cadmus slaying the serpent of earth to found his city of Thebes. We often understand these myths now as hero myths and internalize the other, serpent, dragon, Medusa or Minotaur, as troubling aspects of our own inner nature, which we must learn to overcome. But it is worth remembering their original appearance in our cultural history, so that other strategies of reconciliation may also offer themselves as alternative forms of heroism, so that oppositional thinking does not have to become the only way of coming to a resolution. Our word hero comes from the Greek word heros, simply meaning sacred. The story of Adam and Eve in the garden, which stands at the beginning of our Western tradition, registers the disruption of the original human bond with earth. Here we see the temptation of Eve. Yahweh Elohim, significantly after the Hebrews' 50-year exile in Babylon, is imagined as creating the world completely apart from himself, bringing a new polarity into life, transcendence and immanence. The former life-giving images are now reversed into omens of death. And now the earlier mythic images reappear as actors in history, lending themselves to literal interpretations. The serpent becomes the tempter and betrayer in the Genesis story, and Eve is known as a secondary creation, born from the rib of Adam, further from God, and so more likely to sin, becoming the devil's gateway. But, as the 16th century French theologian and Protestant reformer John Calvin said, if the serpent had approached Adam, it would have been a different story. In one of the three creation myths in Genesis, when taken literally, and only then, we inherit a transcendent God, a fallen universe, original sin inherent in human nature, a curse on the earth and childbearing, and more pervasively perhaps, a distrust of our own spontaneous natures from which imagination comes. Here's the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, Masaccio, 1425. Numinosity was now found in what could not be seen or touched. The graven image was forbidden, and even the longings of the heart were to be punished. As Job said, if I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in brightness, and my heart have been secretly enticed, or my mouth hath kissed my hand, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above. Divinity or consciousness, for the first time, is defined as wholly beyond creation, not immanent in or as creation. This worshipping of transcendence was inherited by the Roman Christian Church. But this was in astonishing contrast to the immanence of the unedited Gnostic texts of the teaching of Jesus, only rediscovered in an urn at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1948. In the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 77, Jesus said, I am the all. The all came forth from me, and the all attained to me. Cleave a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there. Logion 22. When you make the two one, And when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, and the female not be female, then shall you enter the kingdom. Logion 67. He who knows the universe, but knows not himself, knows nothing. This seal is supremely eloquent of what was lost. Jesus hangs outstretched on the cross, crucified as one with Orpheus Bacchikos, with the crescent moon of rebirth as the crown of the cross, and the 7 stars of the Pleiades arching above, also known as the Lyre of Orpheus. Orpheus and Bacchus Dionysus were also Greek names for Osiris, placing Jesus in the 3,000-year-old immanent tradition of the dying and resurrected goddesses and gods, of the earth's annual cycle of renewal and transformation. The image invites us to see through the outward names and forms to the shared essence within. So all these manifestations of the sacred are enriched through their mutual affinity, a joyous way of seeing life called syncretism. By the 4th century AD, the Orthodox Roman interpretation of Christianity had completely suppressed the Gnostics' understanding of a Jesus who belonged to this earth. The Orthodoxy proposed instead a heaven for believers and a hell to which pagans went, a name from the Greek paganos meaning simply of the countryside. But though the Gnostics' Jesus belongs to the millennial tradition of a divine earth, Orthodox Roman Christianity took their Christ, the Anointed One, out of the seasonal cycles of natural life, proposing instead that he was to be the saviour of human history from the ceaseless round of a now inanimate earth, no longer sacred, and so ending the 3,000-year ritual of death and rebirth in nature and human nature, once celebrated as one and the same. Christ's birth was also relocated to the time of the birth of the Roman sun god Mithras at the winter solstice, following the mythical imagery whereby the sun replaced the moon, taking the symbolism of divine rebirth out of nature, though significantly Easter is still celebrated on the first full moon after the spring equinox. Formally, though, the moon was now allocated to his mother Mary as the lesser light. Here is a rendering of the ceremony known as the Coronation of the Virgin by the Veneziano brothers in the 14th century, where we can see the sun and moon beneath their feet. Yet formal Christian doctrine, for nearly 2,000 years, in various papal bulls, has perpetuated the oppositional paradigm of a soul or spirit belonging exclusively to human beings, and usually more exclusively to Christians than to anyone else, while Earth and all Earth's non-human creatures were deprived of soul or spirit, and so presumed to have no feelings or needs, no intrinsic life of their own. They became simply inanimate objects to serve human purposes, effectively dead matter, forgetting that the word matter came originally via mater, for mother. This can be seen in the history of the Church's attitudes to women and childbirth. The faeces and urine of birth, as St. Augustine puts it, as well as anything earthly belonging to this world, along with its focus on original sin and the corresponding need for redeeming it. The idea of the universe as consciousness in or as all creation was from the 11th century called heresy, a word ironically coming from the Greek hieresis, to choose. Over the centuries, the papal bulls insisted on the literal virginity of Mary, and also, to be logical, of her lineage, but did eventually concede to millions of pleas from Catholics all over the world for Mary to play a more significant role in the Christian story. She was declared assumed into heaven, body and soul, in 1950, and Queen of Heaven in 1954, to tumultuous applause in St. Peter's Square in Rome. But in a universe still doctrinally fallen, she was never called Queen of Earth. In many paintings and sculptures, she sits enthroned with the moon beneath her feet, often drawn as the black dragon of death, complete with claws and tail, and so yet again Earth continues to be excluded from any kind of divinity. Yet, when the Christian story of Mary is understood through the archetypal tradition of the Mother Goddess, usually only in art, folklore, and poetry, the ancient divinity of Earth often reappears, as in a 12th century legend of the flight into Egypt, when Mary becomes again the corn goddess, creating the miracle of the grain to hide the baby Jesus threatened by soldiers. This 14th century Madonna from Mainz in Germany, carved out of stone, evokes the feeling of the sacred generosity of earth in her rich crown of fruits and flowers. She holds both the baby Jesus and the tree of life upon which he was crucified. Here his body is the stem and his arms the branches, comprehending birth and death within her far-seeing vision, gazing through and beyond them both. Now we come to the distinction between two terms called spirit and nature. In Orthodox Christian theology, the original polarization between the transcendent heaven and the literally cursed ground of earth in Genesis was perpetuated by a radical distinction between divine spirit and fallen nature. When spirit is contrasted with, or more doctrinally opposed to, nature, it carries the implicit assumption that this is the way things are and have always been, that is, an objective reality. It is then surprising to discover that the origin of our word nature was only formulated by the pre-Socratics in Greece around 600 BC, and only later was separated from and then opposed to spirit. Nature is a Latin word from natus, meaning being born, and is itself a translation of the Greek physis, a verbal noun based on phuo, to grow or appear. C.S. Lewis, another of the Inklings, points out in his book The Discarded Image that physis was an idea first invented by the pre-Socratics to talk about the great variety of growing phenomena under a single name, physis. This was to simplify the existing custom of each place having its own individual name for their own kind of growing phenomena. Though it is significant that the specific particularities, or the unique life, of the plants themselves had become less important than the human convention of understanding the underlying idea common to all of them, and sharing it at a new conceptual level of the mind. This was further complicated when over 200 years later, Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, chose to divide the universe into two regions. The lower region of change he called physis, literally growth, from which we get physical and physics, and the upper region he called uranos, sky. But because the sky also changed with atmosphere and weather, he proposed a still higher level above sky, which he called ether, which did not change, and so was where the eternal gods lived. By introducing this religious element and confining it to what was both changeless and invisible, the implication followed that everything below the moon, that is, where Uranos ended and physis began, was not divine, a judgment perpetuated in formal Christian imagery. Particularly through Aristotle's influence on Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. Having opposed eternity and time, change inevitably took on the ideas of irregularity and inconstancy, disregarding the changeless pattern of phases of change in the lunar model of waxing, waning, death and rebirth, corresponding to the living patterns of growth, death and rebirth taking place on Earth below. Cicero then took up Aristotle's scheme, translating physis into the word natura from Latin natus, to be born. But this new term, nature, had now become secular, birth bringing with it death, whereas the pattern of growth, flowering, death and rebirth were all originally understood as inherent phases of the divine process, and related to humanity through the millennial myths of the dying and resurrected goddesses and gods. Along with Aristotle, Cicero placed all that is eternal above the moon. So by Roman times, natura was nearer to a concept than a deity, and the former identification with Mother Earth, goddess of all, was lost, with the result that Earth moved still further away from the hearts of human beings. Lewis comments, "Nature may be the oldest of things, but natura is the youngest of divinities. Mother Nature is a conscious metaphor. Mother Earth is something quite different. When in Greek times, for instance, she lies beneath Father Sky, he begets, she bears. You can see it happening. This is genuine mythopoeia. But while the mind is working on that level, what, in heaven's name, is nature? Where is she? Who has seen her? What does she do?" In this Roman mosaic, it would seem that allegory has replaced symbolism, and Mother Earth's eternal rebirth is now taken over by Aeon, god of eternity, standing in the circle of the zodiac between the green tree of summer and the bare tree of winter. While Tellus, Mother Nature, the Roman version of Gaia, now much diminished, is seated on the ground with her 4 children, possibly representing the 4 seasons of the year, signifying not eternity, but the changing patterns merely of time. This is a floor mosaic from a villa in Sentinum in Italy, around 200 AD. The internalization of the outer world. In the mid-17th century in the West, this stage of withdrawal of participation intensified, when what was left of Earth's wisdom was transferred to humans, and specifically the saving power, so it was thought, of reason in the Age of Enlightenment. Human consciousness, it was believed, could now at last expand inwards and learn to name and control those outer phenomena whose immanent beauty would otherwise tempt it away from the moral law and the law of reason, believed by many at the time to be the same. This is Isaac Newton by William Blake. Blake's view of Newton is well known. May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep. Letter to Thomas Butts, 1802. He who sees the infinite in all things sees God. He who sees the ratio only sees himself only. Reason, or the ratio of what is already known, is not the same as it shall be when we know more. From There Is No Natural Religion, 1788. The further loss of numinous power in what could be seen and felt in the outer world of nature left human beings more free to shape their surroundings, though also more alone in the midst of them, and so less open to their correction when things went wrong. Nonetheless, the freeing of the outer and inner worlds from each other did allow each to be explored separately, making possible empirical science at one pole and a psychology of consciousness at the other, as well as all stations in between. Out of this latest phase, the so-called flowering of the rational mind was fostered, which was supposed to defy the once overpowering numinosity of nature and banish what it now called superstition. The question of how to reunite the now separated worlds in a new synthesis was not considered. Owen Barfield defines this further stage as internalization, where the inner world is emphatically opposed to the outer world. We can see it in the proliferation of words expressing something new in human thinking, and also words about the act of human thinking itself. John Locke, for instance, in 1634, adopts the word already newly coined, which was consciousness, but defines it for the first time as, quotes, a perception of what passes in a man's own mind, quotes, giving self-consciousness its modern meaning. That was 10 years before Descartes in 1644 came up with his cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Since Descartes, philosophy has typically worked outwards from the individual thinking self, rather than inwards from the cosmos to the soul. What T.S. Eliot called a dissociation of sensibility, the poet Yeats memorably portrayed as that morning when Descartes discovered that he could think better in his bed than out of it. Yeats also wrote of a bursting into fragments, the chief of which was a fragmentation of human beings from nature, both outer nature and our own inner nature, assumed up till then to be of the same essence. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, carrying his crown and eating grass. Plate 24 of the Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Yeah. One law for the lion and ox is oppression, is inscribed beneath him. Blake's conviction that each person has their own instinctive nature and their own unique genius. No bird soars too high if he soars with his own wings, Blake said. Barfield warns that this new kind of consciousness has become so invisibly embedded in the way we now perceive the world that we can hardly recognize it. With the 17th century, he says, the consciousness of myself and the distinction between myself and all other selves, the antithesis between myself, the observer, and the external world, the observed, is such an obvious and early fact of experience to every one of us, such a fundamental starting point of our life as conscious beings, that it really requires a sort of training of the imagination to be able to conceive of any different kind of consciousness. Yet this new radical distinction between inner and outer kept on growing until it became self and not self, and then self and other. Many self-reflective words appeared for the first time, which are now almost impossible to think without. Self-knowledge, for instance, though as a conceptual idea, it does not in that moment implicate us, as did the original verbal command of Socrates, to know thyself. This division of self and not self may have encouraged a habit of thinking in oppositions, in direct contrast to the imagination, which seeks to unify opposites into a new whole, as the Romantic poets explore. It's around this time that the conception of laws governing the outer world arises and grows steadily more impersonal, and then even what is already called matter is described objectively and disinterestedly, while at the same time Earth ceases to be the centre around which the cosmos revolves. In the 17th century alchemical text Atalanta Fugens, Earth, or Mother Nature as she has become, is no longer a goddess, only a personification. It was as though the European drive was to disentangle itself from what it now called its environment, a word from the French environ, which simply means roundabout, while at the same time inevitably becoming more of a spectator than an actor. This is Blake's Infant Joy from the Songs of Innocence and Experience. Barfield concludes that we have to accustom ourselves thoroughly to the thought that the dualism objective-subjective is fundamental neither psychologically, historically, nor philosophically. Dualism, then, is simply a stage in our thinking, a necessary stage, but not inherent in the nature of things. But the legacy of this assumption is that nature and humanity are now polarized in collective assumptions about the nature of reality, beliefs that are difficult to see, let alone suspend. The literary critic Northrop Frye, in his book The Great Code, The Bible and Literature, has warned about what he calls mythological conditioning. Man lives not directly or nakedly in nature like the animals, but within a mythological universe, a body of assumptions and beliefs developed from his existential concerns. Most of this is held unconsciously, which means that our imaginations may recognize elements of it when presented in art or literature without consciously understanding what it is that we recognize. Practically all that we can see of this body of concern is socially conditioned and culturally inherited. Below the cultural inheritance, there must be a common psychological inheritance, otherwise forms of culture would not be intelligible to us. But I doubt if we can reach this common inheritance directly, bypassing the distinctive qualities in our specific culture. One of the practical functions of criticism, by which I mean the conscious organizing of a cultural tradition, is, I think, to make us more aware of our mythological conditioning. The term mythological conditioning suggests that we may be caught in an old myth without realizing it, and further that this may be what continually prevents us from responding to Earth's cry for our help in changing the way we relate to her. The painting is St. Michael and the Dragon, from Les Très Riches du Duc de Berry, from France, 1412. One of the potential dangers of talking about Gaia without having understood the extent of the separation of spirit and nature of the last 2,000 years is that we may unconsciously assume that Gaia is outside us and forget or cannot yet feel deeply enough that we also are Gaia, one of the infinite forms of the consciousness of Earth, or consciousness as Earth. Is it then possible that in ways we can barely conceive, this could also be an aspect of the dynamic self-regulation of the whole, suggested in the Gaia hypothesis? That, in other words, Gaia works through the collective unconscious, or perhaps more evocatively, that Gaia is the latest expression of the soul of the world. In the light of this, it's interesting to see Jung experiencing and foreseeing the end of this 2,000-year period of history. When he writes earlier that hemmed round by rationalistic walls we are cut off from the eternity of nature, he's expressing his awareness of the limitations of reason upon us, but almost as though this is inevitable. This is Jung's painting of his daimon, Philemon, who taught him about the archetypal psyche in his dreams. However, in his later autobiography, it is as though the eternity of nature has come irresistibly to life when he describes his feeling of being, quote, spread out over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves and the clouds, and the animals that come and go, in the processions of the seasons. And it is significant that some pages later he says, the more uncertain I have felt about myself, the more there has grown in me a feeling of kinship with all things. The implication here is that it is uncertainty which may open the heart and release us from the dualism which first separates us from Earth and then interprets the life of Earth as nothing but our own projected life. Perhaps the most arrogant assumption of the myth of the last 2,000 years. If the reciprocal joy of delight and intimacy with nature cannot move us to change our minds, then intellectual uncertainty can become a valid starting point. That willing suspension of disbelief for the moment, as Coleridge advises, for life as for a poem. Similarly, John Keats's plea for negative capability. That is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. All summon the virtue of not knowing to free the imagination. So now we've got to final participation. And to recapitulate, final participation is the opportunity to bring back together the human soul and the soul of the world at a new level through the imagination, by which is meant not only all the imaginative arts, but also bringing imagination into all aspects of life. This is Jacob's ladder, Blake's imagining of Jacob's dream, uniting earth and heaven. Einstein often said that imagination is more important than knowledge. For knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. Since myths are forms of imagination, a new way of being inevitably seeks a new myth, or to turn it around, a new myth becoming numinous inevitably changes our way of being in the world. Joseph Campbell writes, "The old gods are dead or dying, and people everywhere are searching, asking, what is the new mythology to be, the mythology of this unified earth, as of one harmonious being?" Restoring poetry to our vision resembles Thomas Mann's understanding of myth as a late and mature stage of the individual, which comes out of the early youthful engagement with myth, but renders it conscious, and so can live it and not be lived by it. The poet Coleridge's work on imagination came to include the possibility of the conscious will being able to coexist with imagination, without harming it, without diminishing it or driving it away. So the aim is to explore how to relate to imagination with all aspects of our consciousness, intellect, will, and passion, pursuing the dialogue that imagination initiates, rather as a poet does when a poem beckons. Coleridge writes of imagination as a unifying synthetic power, which brings the whole soul of man into activity, and further as the soul that is everywhere and in each, and forms all into one graceful and intelligent whole. And it is this that reveals the eternal in and through the temporal. So the question becomes, how may we see the eternal in and through Earth, who has been dismissed for centuries, if not millennia, as being only and merely temporal? In one sense, the only change that is needed, if only we're not in this case everything, is that we experience our earth again as thou, with all the mutual love, respect, and reciprocity of any personal relationship, as many people already do without even thinking of it, especially, of course, Indigenous people. And this, in the end, is perhaps no more and no less than the Sanskrit understanding of thou art that, tat tvam asi, as perhaps in Blake's painting of Albion or Glad Day. He who binds to himself a joy doth the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise. If we look with Blake's double vision, with the inner and outer eye together, then nature and human nature become naturally permeable to each other. A double vision my eyes do see, and a double vision is always with me. With my inner eye 'tis an old man grey, with my outer a thistle across my way. To a man of imagination, nature is imagination itself. As a man is, so he sees. So here it is we who, following Blake's insight, may, as though in the Eleusinian mysteries, move beyond our customary ways of being and seeing, in such a way as to transform them into a new whole, one where nature, Gaia, Earth, may finally be seen anew as imagination herself. If this sounds unduly idealistic, let us listen to the words of Thomas Berry, who lived from 1914 to 2009. Born in North Carolina, he was a lifelong Passionist monk who became a cultural historian and scholar of the world's religions, especially the religions of Asia, living in China for a year, and also of indigenous people. He would introduce himself, with a twinkle in his eye, as someone who, at the age of 11, fell in love with a meadow, and decided then and forever afterwards that good is what is good for the meadow. Earth comes first, and human beings cannot be moral beings without a corresponding morality to Earth. All his studies opened out into the rest of the universe. His study of theology became a study of history. Western history became Asian history and the history of indigenous peoples, and human history became the history of the Earth, past, present, and future. Whatever was missing from a particular dimension of thought, that was what he sought to explore, forever reaching for the widest, most comprehensive whole, the story of the universe. He was then in a unique position to place the human story and the Earth story within the universe story. And he asked us to recognize that we are now between stories. Like Owen Barfield and the Romantic poets, Thomas diagnosed a way out of our current impasse through the imagination. Loss of imagination and loss of nature, they're the same thing, he said in a telephone conversation in 2008. The way to imagine the new story and bring it to life was to include all the beings in the universe in their own right, given to them with their birth, their own particular right to be who they are. In his Schumacher lectures and in his last books, he taught and wrote the manifesto, Every Being Has Rights. He explored the idea that the natural rights of natural beings come from the same source as human rights, from the universe that brought us, that brought all things, into being. The right to be, the right to habitat, and the right to fulfill one's role in the great community of existence. It followed from this that existing laws, oriented to human beings alone, had to be transformed to include the whole Earth community, of which humans are only a part. He called this Earth jurisprudence. By now he was describing himself not as a theologian, but as a geologian, pointing to the grand liturgy of the universe as sacred in itself, beyond any and all categories of faith. This is what he says. The natural world on the planet Earth gets its rights from the same source that humans get their rights, from the universe that brought them into being. This he called the Great Jurisprudence. Every component of the Earth community has 3 rights: the right to be, the right to habitat, and the right and responsibility to fulfill its role in the ever-renewing processes of the Earth community. All rights are species-specific and limited. Rivers have river rights. Birds have bird rights. Insects have insect rights. Humans have human rights. Difference in rights is qualitative, not quantitative. The rights of an insect would be of no value to a tree or a fish. Human rights do not cancel out the rights of other modes of being to exist in their natural state. Human property rights are not absolute. Each component of the Earth community is immediately or mediately dependent on every other member of the community for the nourishment and assistance it needs for its own survival. This mutual nourishment, which includes the predator-prey relationship, is integral with the role that each component of the Earth has within the community of existence. Thomas was not entirely happy with the language of rights, but considered it to be the best we had to be going on with. Since in 1886 corporations were astonishingly given the rights of individuals, then so at least should Earth, in all her gloriously diverse manifestations, have the rights of an individual life. Law is necessary where morality has failed, and morality is necessary where love is absent. But if we love and so know the meadows, woodlands, rivers, and the whole community of beings who live there, then we feel with them and understand what everyone needs to flourish. Their wounds become our wounds. We're all mutually dependent, mutually reflecting, and mutually enhancing. That is why we need to learn the language of mountains and rivers, trees, birds, animals, insects, and everyone else, and also the language of the stars in the heavens. Is this not, in one of its infinite dimensions, what final participation might look like? Looking back 2,400 years ago, it seems quite reasonable that humans and Earth would be bound together in mutual relationship, so that Gaia would suffer the king's folly, both in herself and also as the only way to bring the king to an awareness of what he has done and ultimately who he is. Yet we have to ask, how is that different from what is happening now at this moment all over the planet? Are we not ourselves, like Oedipus, also guilty of hubris? In the many long centuries of distancing ourselves from Earth, we no longer register what we do. It does not seem to implicate us. How, we wonder, what happened so far away, so high above and deep below? How could it have anything to do with us? We seem to have learned how to deny or explain away the visceral connection between human acts and natural devastation and worldwide infections, habitually resisting the relationship between causes and effects, until we barely recognize the destruction as our own. A classic human failing, but now with consequences far beyond our understanding. There are, of course, many exceptions, especially with Indigenous people, but taking the world's collective response as a whole, do we not, more or less, just wait, hang about, the adolescence of Earth's creation, still expecting her to work it out herself? After all, she always used to. In ancient Greece, Gaia called out once, and she was heard. But what if, in a silent spring, Gaia calls, Persephone calls, and no one is listening, no one can hear. And now there is no Delphic oracle to confront each one of us with the truth of what we are doing and remind us of who we are, children of earth, unless we seek it in our own heart's anguish and act. To end with Einstein, human beings are part of the whole, called by us the universe, part limited in time and space. We experience ourselves, our thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical illusion of our consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and our affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free us from this prison by widening our circle of understanding and compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in her beauty.
Well, maybe we'll begin a conversation as a kind of a way to begin to digest this enormous film that you've made, which is truly undigestible in
any circumstance.
So maybe you should start with the virtue of unknowing and not pretend to know the vastness of what you've touched on in this extraordinary video. We have received a number of very interesting questions, and maybe that would be a good way to start a conversation. Actually, I think I'll begin with the question I asked you yesterday about pollution, really going back to Oedipus and what happens when the natural law and the moral law of humans get separated from one another, but in fact are influencing one another. Because I think near the end of the video, you raised the Oedipus issue of pollution again, and I think you raised it in the context of perhaps the pandemic and climate change and political polarization. One could certainly look at the state of the world with the pandemic, with the political polarization, with climate change, as being in a state of profound pollution. Would you say that?
Well, yes, I think I would really. Of course, in Oedipus Rex, the pollution is in the mind. It's Oedipus, his consciousness, and the consciousness of all of them that is the pollution, and that is automatically embodied in the land because they were so close and understood that they were one. Whereas it seems to me that we've lost that in our long separation from Earth, at least formally in Orthodox thinking. And so we look at it as something far away caused by something out there, which isn't to say it isn't, but it's also brought into life by the way that we don't honor Earth and we don't honor Gaia and as it were, see how she is feeling. In other words, if we lose our own intimate relationship with Earth, then we're bound to understand things as coming at us rather than things that we have brought about by our own negligence or lack of diligence or lack of care or lack of relationship. It seems to me it's all about the relationship that we have with Gaia. If we imagine ourselves in something like Thomas Berry's field, where you feel at one with everyone who's there, it seems inconceivable that a place like that would suffer, because each would nourish each other. And it seems to me that this great separation that we inherit, really, though we don't need to perpetuate, stops us feeling the intimacy of Earth and the intimacy of our own relationship with Earth, with Gaia. It helps if we see her as a being, a mother goddess, if we like, or not goddess, but at any rate, an intimately living being, not dead matter. And we don't ever think consciously dead matter, but it's not far away to feel that it's rather ridiculous to start talking to a flower or a bee or the earth, whereas in fact, it's the most wise sense, it seems to me, that we do talk to everyone on earth, not just human beings.
You know, we live in a bullet point society or culture where when you describe a problem, or then you look for bullet point solutions to that problem. We all are sort of prone to that as soon as you talk about something being in distress, you look for the diagnosis, and you make the diagnosis, and then you want to prescribe the treatment. And so I think in listening to these videos, there's a natural impulse in all of us to have a prescription for the cure. And of course, the way in which you're talking, particularly the way in which you evoke imagination, is not really prone to sort of bullet point thinking.
No. Absolutely.
So that we're not able, or you're not able to offer, I was going to say practical solutions. That's not quite right, but people like to be prescribed.
Yes.
A way forward, and your prescription for the way forward, maybe that's the way of asking the question. If you were able to prescribe on the basis of this fantastic work you've done, I think it's implicit in what you've already said in the film, but if you were to prescribe a way forward based on your diagnosis of this 25-year 100 process of the splitting between nature and spirit, what would your prescription be? And forgive me for making it so concrete.
No, well, forgive me for not really having a proper answer, but I would say two things I would say come to me when you put it that way. And perhaps the first is that we care for intimately that part of life that is around us, our own Gaia, shall we say, whether we have a garden or not, whether we go into the countryside, that wherever we reach Gaia, we are responsible human beings. We care. It's a relationship. It's this relationship of intimacy that Thomas Berry talks about. And he lived in a cell for goodness knows how many years of his life as a Passionist monk. So I think that's the first practical thing, as Indigenous people do. They know their countryside, their forests, their fields, that there's this relationship, and they are responsible. And that would be the first thing which we can all do. And I think that has to go along with the fact that we should guard against the separations in our minds that come so naturally to us, in a sense. We don't really notice them. We don't necessarily mean any harm or mean to be arrogant or any of the things. that perhaps some religions would have us feel we have a right, even if we've dismissed that or we don't feel it's presented right. I still think it's difficult because we come at the end of so much polarization of reason and instincts and reason and feeling, and does that make sense? And so that really we need to remember our love for the universe, and our imagination brings that towards us. We can always be imagining and reimagining how it would be if we all together, of course, as many of those of us who could, wanted Gaia to be related to us, and us to be related to Gaia, and us to learn from Gaia. And Indigenous people are always learning from what comes to them from outside, from beyond themselves. And that we mentioned yesterday when John Locke redefined, as it were, consciousness as coming from the human beings to go outwards. I think that's sort of stuck inside all of us, often in the way that little children are shown how to name things outside them before they've made a relationship with them, before they've become friends with whoever it is or whatever it is, when you might wish to not have a collective name, but an integral relationship. So I think that we should beware of naming things from afar, anything that we do from afar. Not that we don't need to frequently, but that this is the way that we've probably been misdirected, because it used to be that the universe would come to the person's heart and then they would work it out, as it were, together. In other words, you wouldn't be coming from a human place out to the world and making your path upon it. It would be a mutual relationship. And why would it not be now? Why could we not try and reinstate a mutuality with wherever we go? We try with each other, of course, in human beings terms, so it goes without saying. But then why does it not go without saying with the birds, animals, bees, and so forth of nature? So you wouldn't then use pesticides and kill them. You would think of another way, although it'd be more trouble. And you wouldn't, all sorts of things that we shrug and think, oh, well, the big companies, it can't be helped. But it has to be helped. It can be helped. If we really believed it, we wouldn't allow it. So I would say we have to change both ways in our own intimate relationships and in what we tolerate as being told is necessary or is cheaper or is all the other values they are, which we're only too used to, but are they the right values? Are they the values we can go forward from? Maybe the pandemic is even suggesting that something is wrong with us. What do you think?
Well, what came to mind is the phrase, I think it was used by Jung for individuation, opus contra natura,
Yes.
work against nature.
Yeah.
The problem is that or not, the issue is that what's become natural to us is a way of thinking and being in which things are divided. The 2,000-year history of splitting nature and spirit has become our own indigenous culture, if you will.
Yes.
And so the opus contra natura right now would be to work against, in a way, I think it's exactly what you're saying, working against our own acculturated nature.
Yes.
How we exist in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a pretty radical prescription.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, look at Thomas Berry.
Yeah.
He made it.
Yeah. Yeah.
He wouldn't call himself a theologian any longer, because it felt like it was a split. Theos, God, and the rest of us, earth. So he calls himself a geologian, and then renders it from geo, earth, into being a sacred reality, which is divine. So you get there, you don't lose anything, you just get there through earth, through Gaia. Or you could do that.
We have a very active participation in the questions, and there's no way we're going to be able to get to all of them or even many of them, but I would like to introduce a few into our conversation.
Yes,
actually, I'm going to start with one that that's so funky and nice because it's somebody who brings a fresh vision and curiosity to this material. You and I have been swimming in this material for a long time. So the question is, why are there so many snakes?
Oh, gosh. Well, do we need an extra one in the Garden of Eden?
I think it's the response to all of the imagery from classical Gaia that there's snakes everywhere.
Yes,
and
that's right.
And so it's like, this is to somebody who's not immersed in this material.
Yeah.
You suddenly feel like you're swimming in snakes.
No, actually, I think it's a brilliant question. The thing is that in the ancient cosmologies, in the goddess traditions and earlier, the snake was a miracle because he she shed his skin and was reborn. So the snake becomes a symbol of rebirth, that of the perpetuation of life, that it doesn't end, it just changes its form. And all the goddess myths had snakes in them. Usually they were holding up snakes, or they were coiling around their head, or whatever. So it's really what it's saying in the ancient myths, that this is eternity. Eternity is in time. There isn't any difference, was what the goddess myths were saying. But then when we come to Genesis, which from their point of view was obviously not wanting to inherit anything from the goddess myths, the snake is completely turned around and becomes the betrayer and the indirect reason for Eve and then Adam and then being expelled from paradise. So it's a fascinating symbol that everybody lands on.
Yes, and it happened at Delphi too, where when Apollo, I think, replaced Hermes, if that's correct, as sort of the master god of Delphi, Python was slain. Isn't that right? That represented a new order coming to Delphi itself?
Yes, that is right. Yes, there's a hymn to Apollo where Apollo slays the Python. Yes, whereas in fact the original person who gave the oracles was the Python, as it were. She was called the Python, in fact. Funnily enough, there's a book about that from what's his name, who gave the William Golding, who gave the story to whoever he is.
Lovelock, to Lovelock.
Lovelock, that's right, Lovelock. Just about that. In fact, just about that, the Python, of handing it over and how sacred it was, and then became not. Of course, what's sacred for one way of thinking becomes anathema to another. That was so with the Babylonians and Tiamat. She was turned into a snake. She wasn't a snake. She was a perfectly reputable goddess to begin with. So it's interesting.
And she could have been a perfectly reputable snake in the old mythology, right? I mean,
she could,
the snake was reputable.
Yeah, it was reputable, yes. And they all had to be killed.
Well, you have many reputable snakes around.
We do. We have some lovely snakes, absolutely.
Here's another interesting question, and please, for those of you who have submitted questions, you have to bear with us that we're going to just be able to get to a few of them. But the very interesting question was actually turning the whole presentation upside down, which is the tradition that believes that images themselves can obscure the numinous or can obscure the sacred. Is that something you have a response to?
Well, I do. But I don't wish to. I can understand where that comes from. I actually think. I guess it doesn't really matter whether you have an image or whether you don't. It's what works for you to send you into the state of mind that you feel is sacred. I'm slightly nervous of banishing of images because of Genesis, and because I think that images come to us in our dreams and they show us things that we couldn't possibly know we had thought. And indeed, we as humans perhaps didn't think them. They come from the archetypal unconscious. I mean, the archetypal unconscious doesn't usually come to us as a blank without an image, does it? Usually speaks to us through images. So, but I think you could equally say that when you meditate, there is a way of meditation where you leave the images behind. But I think perhaps we need both, whichever whichever is needed.
Yeah, I like that answer very much. There's I think a really interesting question that springs out of the video from yesterday, which is the relationship, how you might see the relationship between Gaia and the origins in India in Gayatri, and how one might go about understanding more about that.
Well, yes, I mean, Gayatri in India, as Satish Kumar told me, who is Indian himself, we had a little tutorial in the Schumacher College pub about the Gaia in ancient India, which was very illuminating. And she was even larger, even more primary to everything in India. And so the Gayatri mantra was the first manifestation from the void, as it were, from the as they put it in India. And indeed, it's not so different that she's the first to arise from chaos in the Greek myth in the 8th century BC. It's just that chaos, in fact, in Greek, it doesn't mean quite what we call chaos. It's really more like just an absence of a void of not being quite there yet, potentiality of life. So in a way, they have kept that, the ancient Greeks, but without the enormous reverence that they had in India for Gayatri.
Yeah. Here's a question. I think I'll read the whole question. Thank you so much for your research. It was illuminating. I wonder how can we, and this is the question that most people are going to ask in one way or another. I wonder how we can actively heal this perceptive fracture we are living in. And I suspect the perceptive fracture might be between spirit and nature. What are the most effective ways to spread this way of thinking in order to have a significant change in our society? And hopefully a political change that would care more for Earth rights. This again is, what do we do with this? How do we take this into the world? Or how do we take this into ourselves?
Yes, exactly. Well, I think that if we could think of nature as spirit and spirit as nature, as it were, if we would refuse the opposition, if we would just see that nature is spiritual and spirit is natural, however we bring them together as one. I mean, I don't actually ever think of the spirit any longer. Personally, I just see nature as in closing everything. But that's a kind of play on the fact that, yes, they were separated. But if we go back to Gaia, I think that's perhaps one of the points why the Gaia hypothesis, being called that, is helpful. Gaia has both of those. I mean, like the Gayatri mantra, it was spirit given form. And the form we call it nature, but then that's a late term. as we saw. But they're both one. They're one in the invisible world, and they're one in the visible world. It seems to me that sounds weird to say nature has spirit or is spiritual, but why is it weird?
What comes to mind is sort of the Jung's off quoted, and I won't get the quote right, but basically he said that the fate of the world hinges on the individual psyche, or the psyche of the individual. And I probably misinterpreted that, but at some point I began to disagree with that, because I don't think the change in the individual psyche, or an individuating psyche, or whatever you want to call it, is sufficient. That we need a transformation in the collective psyche, and so the question then becomes, well, what does the question become? I guess the change in the collective psyche really requires a new mythology that's numinous. And I think that's how you described it, that has so much energy inherent in it that many of us are brought along in it. Not that we got there individually even, but that it becomes the new way of being. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, I quite agree with you, Tom. Look what Campbell said. What is the new mythology to be? The mythology of this earth as one unified being, and a bit better, more. But so yes, I think, and everybody is talking. I mean, Thomas Berry talks that we're between myths. With the old myth doesn't really cover Gaia, and the new myth isn't quite come into being yet. But so therefore, yes, we are hopefully contributing to a new way of thinking about Earth, which later societies might call a new myth. But we're just trying to bring a new way of thinking into being that isn't absurd. In fact, it's actually called upon. It calls us, I think, because the other won't do. The old one won't do.
Yeah, this actually reminds me of something you've mentioned to me, which is that Lovelock himself, I think perhaps in a personal conversation with you, got uncomfortable about the Gaia, what became known as the Gaia theory, being picked up by the New Age and not really being what he was talking about. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I was trying to. We were having lunch at Schumacher College, both teaching on the new course on Gaia, in fact. But he was, I think he felt it was going to be weakened and abused and used for another way of thinking that didn't belong to it. And I quite feel for that. But the thing is, a new scientific, as David Bohm would tell us, a new scientific reality involves all of us, involves a completely new way of thinking. And as David Bohm says, who knew Lovelock, we should start thinking in verbs, not nouns, as it were. In other words, anything that comes forward to us that we run with is, if we're running right, it's good. So that the fact that it's taken away and used as a metaphor or a symbol for other ways of thinking, for changing our mode of thinking, that's absolutely wonderful, it seems to me.
Yeah, good. Here's a really interesting, it's the comment question. I'm really testing your gymnastic ability in terms of having to jump around from
all
this
off the run,
but I like this thought question. May we not consider phenomena such as climate change, environmental pollution, technology, Trump, Johnson, as intelligences, that is part of the world's soul, that is as a part of a unified vision, rather than thinking of these phenomena as other to self and Gaia? It's a very...
No, it's absolutely right. And of course we should think of them as all belonging. And then but then may we also consider where to put them in our mind. as long as we don't stand back helplessly. But yes, no, of course, it's all part of it. And Trump and Johnson, they are, in one sense, what we have made of the preceding centuries, and they've every right to express themselves as they do. But we also have a right to feel that they are expressing an older way of thinking, an individualistic and self-promoting, perhaps in some cases, way of thinking that we don't feel now, although it belongs to the whole, it belongs as a warning to us to offer ourselves perhaps more openly to Gaia. It's a warning, I think. It's very easy to clutch things for ourselves, and human nature, there's always been that in us to do. But someone like Thomas Berry, that would be anathema to, and he gets along okay. So we therefore, we have our models. They're all there, and they're all in us, ultimately. We're all capable of being all of those people.
Well, that's in the mythology of Gaia herself, isn't it? That she gave birth to these monstrous, the three monsters.
Precisely.
Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And she wanted to include them, and Uranus wanted to kill them.
Yes.
And he won. Okay. But there are 2 points of view, and her point of view, we also understand. She tolerated that it wasn't ugly to her.
Yes,
it was something that needed managing and needed finding the virtue in, and leaving it to where the virtue could be expressed.
In another direction, the one participant would like a comment on the relationship between the misogynistic attitude that is pervasive in much of the world and the plight that we find ourselves in with Gaia and Mother Nature. Are they related, is the question.
Yeah, well, yes, I think they are, especially historically. And the book that I wrote with Anne Baring on the myth of the goddess really tries to follow some of this. And the danger of identifying Gaia with the female or feminine points of view is enormous, because Gaia is beyond both male and female. She's the first to arise from chaos. You don't come, we call her a mother goddess, and she has a Greek feminine name, but in earlier times, the mother goddesses, and even in Paleolithic times, they also had male heads and female heads. They didn't have this radical distinction that sometimes turns up between females and males in our culture now. And I think that's partly a result of the Enlightenment ages and the earlier centuries. So I don't think it's a helpful distinction that we make between males and females. We're all children of Gaia. Gaia isn't mother as in not father. I mean, I don't think they had this problem quite in the old, in the Paleolithic, for example. Look at the goddess of Lucelle. She's the moon. Well, the moon has a male aspect as well as a female aspect in pretty well all the myths. She can start out as one or the other, but it's not what it's about.
In the original participation, there wasn't the same polarization of gender or sex in the way that we make it.
Absolutely. I think you don't see it in the art. I mean, we went there obviously, but you see, in fact, in the goddess of Lesbos, the 10 lines of pregnancy coming from her bottom. And it's really, of course, in our century, this was interpreted as a sexual come on. But that just shows the way that we've lost that sort of sacredness, at least. And when the early people tried to interpret Lascaux, they saw the horse as having been killed with an arrow. Was our later thoughts about life, but in fact it was a plant, and it was when they got closer examination of it, it was a symbol of growth. So I think that the male dominance, if we call it that, comes in with the Babylonians. That if you notice what they did to Tiamat, who wasn't a female goddess, never mind the male, it wasn't like that. You get nothing of that in the earlier literature. You only get it in the second withdrawal from nature.
So we project so we project our own splits back into our interpretations of these earlier cultures, when in fact we may be quite wrong.
Well, we're proved whenever it goes closer, the magnifying glass, as it were, we're proved wrong. Yes. I think that's absolutely right. That's the real danger. And it's the danger of anything, that we project our own distinctions onto anything we can.
Well, I was talking to a friend yesterday who viewed this, and she was commenting on how incredibly rich yesterday's video was, and of course how incredibly rich today's video is, and the question was, how can we offer this in a way that's digestible, because it's so rich and full. And I've been thinking about that, and I want to talk to you about that, a way of our taking this extraordinary creation, imaginative creation that you've put together, and bringing it into the world in a way that's more digestible. Not that it's not digestible.
No, it's okay. I know it's indigestible. But what do you do, especially when it's only supposed to be an hour?
Yeah, well, we're gonna think about this, but it is so rich, and it's such a pleasure to be with you and to kind of tap your unbelievably beautiful mind as well as spirit and soul. You're just the best, of course. I mean, it's such a beautiful piece of work you've done, and it's even more beautiful to hear you talk about it and respond to specific questions, and see how your mind and heart and spirit and soul all work together. It's not divided, and so in that sense you become a model for all of us, which I'm sure you don't want to be.
No.
But I think
I'm sorry, I was going to say, if we'd broken it up into more digestible pieces, we wouldn't get the whole, would we? We'd lose sight of the whole. It's always a problem. I'm sure I could take advice on this, but
well, I actually totally agree with you. I think one needs to be sort of one needs to swim in the whole, and then one needs to be able to go back and get bits and pieces of it, because it represents the fruit of so much thinking and reflection. And so this is something we'll talk about. I have no intention of asking you to break up the whole. One thought I had, actually just one thought I had, was to take the whole and the narrative and then make a separate piece in which we take the images and the text and make that a piece that goes along with the video, so that of course, the video is so rich in the way image moves from image and text moves from text. Anyway, the whole is just
something.
This is what I'm trying to do is empathize with all of
Me too. Yeah,
trying to
who find
take
it
in
all
the
too much at
richness.
once.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
just
No,
fantastic,
it is
and
difficult.
it's thrilling to be part of it, and it's thrilling to be able, as Eris, to present this incredibly rich contribution, and so you'll
Privilege
just
to
have to
have.
accept. You'll just have to accept my gratitude and our thanks for the work that you've done. I do want to just, as we wind up, mention one or two things. I have so many notes that I've taken that so first of all, for those of you who wish to continue a conversation based on our initial Gaia Then and Now, we do have the forum in which you can contribute thoughts and ideas and reflections and criticisms or whatever. And you can get to the forum by going to Archipelago, the Eris Outreach Center, and then you'll find a forum specifically for Gaia Then and Now, and you could add your thoughts there. If you have images that you think really speak to what we've been talking about, what Jules has been talking about, you can send images to info@eris.org, because we're going to create an Eris, a Gaia Then and Now gallery to go along with this.
Okay.
Actually, Jules's two videos are just the beginning of this series. We have several other events on a monthly basis, because what we're going to try to do is bring the Gaia Then and Now. We're going to try to see where other people are going with Gaia now, and then we'll go back to Gaia Then in another consideration of the ancient goddesses, to kind of, because we have to circle around this material. You don't get it all at once. You go around and around of it. So we have the next presentation on February 10th, Thursday, February 10th in the evening, will be on how contemporary artists are taking up the themes of what we've been talking about in terms of Gaia and the relationship to the earth. So we're going to have a presentation by my niece, Brooke Singer. This is totally nepotistic, except she happens to be a wonderful artist and thinker in her own right. And she's going to take us on a tour of how modern contemporary digital media artists and others are tackling the very themes that Jules has been laying out for us. So that's going to be our next event on February 10th. And you'll get a notice from Eris, all of you who have registered and are participating, about when the next event is. And we hope you'll stay with us, because this 6-part presentation, really the goal is to go back and forth between Gaia Then and Gaia Now, as a way of circling around this wonderful material. So I think that's about it for today. Jules, do you have anything else you'd like to say?
No, not really. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and sitting through it, and I hope it wasn't too much at once, and everything that all of us do. I think we're brought back into Gaia whenever we relate feelingfully to anything. It isn't that we've lost it. It's that we sometimes think across it. But I think we aren't so far away as we might think we sometimes are. And I'd like to thank you, Tom, for all you've done to bring this into being. It's all your work, really.
Well, it was stimulated by seeing your two videos. That was the beginning of conceiving of this project. Came straight from Gaia.
Well, that's all right then.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for
very
staying with us and participating in this, and we hope you'll continue to participate.